Everything was planned by Mao Zedong as early as 1949. Following the then recent victory of the Communist Revolution, Mao revived China's old imperial ambitions to impose its sovereignty on Tibet. He was not concerned by historical realities, or that the country had been governed for centuries by the Dalai Lamas. The first phase of the Maoist initiative was simple: to force the Tibetan authorities to admit that the Chinese forces marching upon their country were not an army of conquerors, but an army of liberation from Western imperialism.
When Chinese army entered 1950 in the Tibetan area under Dalai Lama's government's jurisdiction, the Chinese army already crushed around 7,000 to 8,000 Tibetan soldiers. Army, all crashed. So then the Chinese army can go up to Lhasa without any resistance. But then the Chinese leadership, they stop the Chinese army on eastern part of autonomous region of Tibet, the Chamdo area, stop there. Then the discussion about agreement is started. Although that agreement, according sort of expert, that also is an agreement signed under duress.
When the 17-point agreement was signed on May 17, 1951, Tibet lost Amdo, the Dalai Lama's native province, and Kham, which were both annexed by the Chinese. Reduced to its western portion, Tibet retained an autonomous government and its social and religious traditions. A minor concession for Mao, who'd obtained what he wanted. Tibet was declared liberated and not annexed to show that it had always been Chinese. From this point on, any criticism of China's policy in Tibet would be condemned as interference in the internal politics of the country. The first phase of Mao's plan was complete. Mao was perfectly aware of this, but no matter. He had obtained Tibet's surrender and the Dalai Lama posed no further threat to him. The power of this young man of 17 was limited to the religious sphere, and as a good Marxist, Mao trusted in his propaganda to wean the Tibetans away from their living Buddha. The Chinese army continued its progress towards Lhasa in a peaceful march that the Chinese news broadcast to their people. It was with more curiosity than animosity that the Tibetan population, isolated from the world for centuries, watched the arrival of these strange invaders posing as liberators.
这是个荒凉的地方。
British India. To the west, the expanding Russian Empire. To the east and north, Imperial China. The Chinese had always claimed Tibet to be part of China, a claim they had only rarely been able to enforce. In the 1930s and 40s, a few outsiders had visited Tibet. Mostly British political representatives come up from India. These pictures from the films they took reveal Tibet as a medieval country, devoted to its spiritual and earthly leader, the Dalai Lama. To the British in India, Tibet had been a convenient buffer along the northern frontier of the empire. Tibet's isolation had served the British well, but by 1950, the British had left India. The last British representative was gone from Lhasa. The garden parties at the Dekilinka, where the British had stayed, were but a memory. There was a new world order now. In China, racked by war since the founding of the Republic in 1911, Mao's forces had finally triumphed. The communists were now ready to enforce the old claim that Tibet was part of China. In Peking, they solemnly declared that Tibet was next to be liberated. There is today just one European, an Austrian, who had first-hand experience of what happened in Lhasa in the last days of 1950.
I had been living in Lhasa for 5 happy years. After escaping from a British internment camp in India, together with Peter Aufschneider, we had reached Lhasa, became employees of the Tibetan government. I also became friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. By 1949, the Chinese threatened Tibet with what they called liberation. Everybody in Lhasa knew that the Chinese were going to carry out this threat.
The Tibetans loved their independence and were clearly entitled to enjoy it. They had no wish to be liberated. The little Tibetan army was hurriedly reorganized under the supervision of a cabinet minister. Monks and officials were trained as officers. New regiments were raised and the richer classes called upon to furnish and equip another 1,000 men. Not only the material means of defense were mobilized, but also the spiritual forces of the people. Religion, the most powerful element in the life of the country, had to be invoked. All the monks in Tibet were ordered to attend public services. Offerings were doubled, rare and powerful amulets brought out of old chests. Meanwhile, Radio Peking was already sending out messages in Tibetan promising that Tibet would soon be freed. As the threat of liberation grew, it seemed as if the entire population of Tibet had packed the narrow streets of Lhasa in pious enthusiasm for the religious festivals which in 1950 surpassed in pomp and splendor anything I had ever seen. Despite the threat from the Chinese, the ceremonies vital to the running of the state had to continue. 4 weeks after the great New Year festival, the 20,000 monks of the monasteries around Lhasa descended once again into the city for the second prayer festival. The people believed with rock-like faith that the power of religion would suffice to protect their independence. On October the 7th, 1950, the Chinese attacked the Tibetan frontier in 6 places simultaneously and swept aside the little Tibetan army. Should the Dalai Lama stay or flee? The Tibetan government could not make such an important decision. The gods must have the last word. The state oracle said, "Flee." I felt like a spectator at a play who foresaw the tragic denouement and was saddened by the inevitable end, but had run down on feudalism, and they knew it. They headed southwards across the Tsangpo River along the old trade route to India. News of the Dalai Lama's approach soon reached the Tibetan town of Gyantse. Small white stones were laid along the sides of the streets to ward off evil spirits. Incense fires burned in welcome. Monks and nuns flocked from the monasteries and convents, and the whole population waited for hours to receive their king and beg him not to leave them. Every place in which the Dalai Lama spent a night was automatically consecrated as a chapel. The party carried on across the Himalayas towards India. I saw the young God King riding slowly by on his grey horse. The enemy was in the land, and the ruler's flight was only the first step towards greater misfortunes. 16 days after leaving Lhasa, the caravan halted in the Chumbi Valley on the borders of India.
I stayed with His Holiness in the Chumbi Valley for 3 more months, still believing that we might be able to return to Tibet, that the world would listen to the cries of Tibet to stay as an independent country. But then I realized it was the end of the old Tibet, so I said goodbye to the Dalai Lama. Now a communist country was occupying their home, so my sadness was of course very, very great, because I knew that I won't ever see my friends in Tibet again.